Super. I'm very glad that our guest at our second class session of our late spring season is Father Richard Peers, the Dean of Llandaf Cathedral, Byddwn yn Cyrraedd heno fel yn gweithdai fel hael westeni yn sesiwn hwyr y gwanwyn o Clas Ddeon Llandaf, Richard Peers. Father Richard, thank you so much for making the time to be with us. You're the first of, I think, what might be an occasional series of Welsh deans visiting us virtually up here in Bangor. So thank you for being our guinea pig. It's been a lovely day here up in Bangor. How is it down there on the Cathedral Green in Llandaf?
Well, Brynandar, it's a lovely afternoon, early evening here. It's been sunny all day. It's been a perfect day here, and I'm really glad to be with you. You know, Diolch Gadeirlan for inviting me to be part of this conversation, which I'm really looking forward to.
Thank you. I've really valued being allowed to attend the meetings of the Welsh Cathedral Deans, and that sense of colleagueship between cathedrals, places with similar but also distinctive missions across Wales. It's great to see perhaps a deeper relationship, and these conversations might be one little modest manifestation of that. I tend to start these conversations in the beginning. Tell us, what was childhood like for young Richard, and how did God make an appearance in all of that?
Yes, I never remember a time when I didn't feel in relationship with God. So I came from a very devout family, and we prayed together every day. We would never go to bed without praying together. We would never eat without praying together. We went to Mass every Saturday, made our confessions, first communions every Saturday. Every Sunday we would go to church at least twice. And I had an uncle who was a priest, a great uncle who was a priest. And always on a Sunday lunchtime, there would be a priest or a religious sister joining us for Sunday lunch. And I had a brother who died when I was 5 years old and he was 7 years old, and a very strong sense that he was always present with us, that the dead were part of who we were. And he was buried in a local church cemetery where there were, you know, I don't know, 15, 16 of my really quite close relatives buried, great-grandparents, great uncles and things like that. So I had a very strong sense from very early on of this ongoing existence of the dead. I think that was very significant for me. I told my reception teacher when I was 4 years old that I wanted to be a priest. And I've never imagined that I would do anything else. And you know, it's been the most fantastic way of living a life. I've been ordained now for 30 years. And it's just such a gift. It's the gift that keeps on giving, as they say. So from early childhood, that sense of the divine, that sense of prayer. I mean, I described myself in a sermon here yesterday as a prayer addict. You know, I love praying. I think it's the most wonderful thing to do, to be able to be in relationship with the divine, with God, but also that, you know, to pray for others. And that's always been an important part of my life as well. You know, and when, you know, people, you know, wearing a collar on a bus or walking into town here in Cardiff, when people say, "Will you pray for me, Father?" I always write their name down, and I do, and I always say it out loud in church. And when people leave their prayer requests in church, I always say them out loud. And it's such a gift, you know, to be able to do that and to be that person that can do that for people. And then the revelations that people make as you walk alongside them, as you sit on the bus with them, or as you meet them in church. You know, just, you know, so I can't think of a better way. If I died tonight at the end of this call, I can't think that I could have lived a more interesting and exciting and joyful life.
I've learned that from you, I think, to ask for a name and to pray by name, and even there and then, if that's possible, that's a very valuable gift. I think I might have been a bit lax previously in terms of saying, please be assured of my prayers, but actually to ask for a name and to be sure to do that out loud is a very good prayer discipline.
And I think it's really easy. It's too easy to say we're praying for world peace or for an end to poverty. You know, I mean, those are, yeah, we all think that, don't we? But to pray for Doris, you know, who is in hospital, or for Jack, who has just died. And I think one of the great things about the Christian life is that it's very specific. You know, so when God wanted to show how much he loved the world, he didn't kind of put I don't know, whatever, a major sign up around the whole planet. He came to a tiny place as a person with a name, who was born to a mum and a dad, foster father, whatever we say. You know, it's the specific that's really important. And that's partly what I love about being here, about being wherever I've been, is engaging and learning and knowing a community, and people's names and their life stories and their, you know, their specificity, if that's a real word.
I was reading back a sermon I preached a couple of summers ago on the beginning of my engagement seriously with religion, with faith and hope and love, and that started for me with an experience of grief. And I wondered, I've read some of what you've written about the death of your brother and the influence of that, and the way that our experience of God often starts from a place of suffering or pain more than a place of triumph or joy or certainty. I wonder, was that part of your experience, or that odd mixture of loss and promise at the same time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm often struck when I meet other clergy, other ministers of all sorts, other Christians, that, you know, there is the grief moment is a profoundly disrupting moment, and important moment. Yeah, I mean, I you know, and it's quite interesting. And you know, I've worked with children, so I was a teacher for much of my ministerial priestly career as well. And you know, I think we underestimate the effect of death on children. And I mean, my brother and sister and I think would all say that the death of my brother David was the most significant part of our childhood. We had a very happy childhood. We had loving parents. We all feel very loved. But you can't get away from the fact that, you know, David died, you know, and that's, you know, absolutely shocking. You know, I can't think of a strong enough word. Shocking isn't strong enough for it. It's completely disruptive of what the normal course of what we think life should be. And I would say, you know, to any parent, but my parents never got over it. You know, you know, when I sat with my mum and my dad as they died, you know, my dad always said, nobody will remember him. That was his biggest fear, that nobody would remember my brother David. And of course, that's true. And so that's shocking and dark, and you know, there is no kind of, you can't say anything that will make that all right. You know, so I think absolutely grief. You know, and for Christians, you know, death is at the heart of the religion, isn't it? You know, Jesus died, and we believe in the risen Christ. So we don't assimilate or incorporate death into our view of the world. We are going to be in a very weak place indeed, I think.
As you mentioned, a vocation to be a teacher has been part of your priestly vocation as well, and before you moved to Christ Church in Oxford, you were the head of a large London school. Tell us a bit about that interweaving of a teaching vocation and a priestly vocation. How did that come about, and how did that develop?
Well, I think it's really significant. I mean, Jesus is addressed by many names in the Gospels, but he is addressed 44 times, I think it is, more than double than any other name, as teacher. And I think within the priestly ministry, teaching is, well, it's essential, isn't it? I mean, you preach, you teach by the way you live, you teach by the way you relate to people. I think that's absolutely essential. For me, that came particularly because for part of my teenage years, we lived very near Downry Abbey near Newbury, which is a Benedictine monastery, which also at that time ran a school. And I think that kind of model of priest-teacher was hugely significant for me and formative for me as a teenager. And at every stage of my priestly ministry, I mean, I've absolutely loved working in schools as a chaplain, as a teacher, as a deputy head teacher, and director of education. And I think, the opportunity to work with young people and to explore, what it is to be a person who's exploring faith, I mean, it's just the most exciting and interesting thing. And also, I think for me, very interesting to think what it is to have church schools, which are such a gift to us, both in the church in Wales and previously in the Church of England. I mean, I'm really fortunate here to have 3 schools in the parish, a primary, a secondary, and an independent school. And the choristers here, I mean, every night I try and address in some way I've just done it now at Evensong, not just a boring descriptive thing about the anthem, but a kind of faith thing about the anthem. So tonight we had Philip Stopford's "Do Not Be Afraid." So I just, 1 minute, I hope, said to the children, "What are you afraid of? Do not be afraid." It's the most common phrase in the Bible. So I think being a teacher is an amazing and wonderful gift, and nurturing children is an amazing and wonderful gift, and it's profoundly a part of priesthood. And I can't imagine, I mean, we have, here at Llandaf, we have this most extraordinary thing, which is, there were 196 children in the Sunday school on Sunday, and, their various parents and things like that. And we must use that gift and accept that gift to teach and to introduce people to Jesus. It's a fabulous thing.
I want to get closer to Llandaf in my questions. You were head in London, the Director of Education for the Diocese of Liverpool, and then the Sub-Dean of ChristChurch Cathedral in Oxford. And I knew you towards the end of that time, and I think sensed in you a sense of closeness to the Church in Wales, and perhaps a vocation to serve within the Church in Wales. How did that come about? What did that feel like? How did you discern that vocation to exercise priestly ministry in Wales?
I often think of myself as a sort of Jesuit in a strange kind of way. And the Jesuits have always said that the first thing to do is learn the language. And they don't just mean the language, they mean the culture, the community, the place. And they go where they're sent. So they're not people who belong anywhere, but people who minister in a place. And I think that's quite important. So in every place that I have ministered, I recognize that I am not a person entirely of that place, but that I am sent to that place. And in, the relationship with the Church in Wales has been really interesting. For about 20 years, I can't even remember how it began and who it began with. I mean, my partner, Jim, spent several years of his childhood on Anglesey, and his father was in the RAF. So there's been a kind of draw to that. We have a house very near the Welsh border in the northwest, and there's been a draw through that. I've known clergy of the Church in Wales for 20 years, been a spiritual director to clergy of the Church in Wales for all of that time, led many retreats at Llangasti, here in the south of Wales, but also at Gladstone's Library in the north of Wales. Often I've preached and taught on the Welsh poets. I'm reading a new paper on Anne Griffiths at the moment, and I've brought with me to show you Manon's wonderful book of poetry, which I preached on yesterday at Newport Cathedral. Ydydd. I mean, my gosh, this tradition of the poet priest, this tradition of the poetic imagination is at the heart of Anglicanism. And if we could only root ourselves in this tradition as Anglicans, that would be, we would be drawing on deep waters indeed, I think, and have deep roots in all of that. So there's been a kind of, a kind of relationship with the church in Wales that's just kind of been continuous. And so I'm delighted that, I'm here now, which is probably almost certainly my last job, to finally get here and live here. I've been trying to learn Welsh for 20 years, and as you will already have noticed, I'm not very good at it. But, I love the language. I love hearing the language. And, I hope that we are now using more Welsh in Llandaf Cathedral than probably has ever been used for 1,000 years. And I think I love living in a bilingual culture, because it makes you pinch yourself about language, I think, and makes you not make assumptions about what you're saying and what people hear that you're saying, which I think is really important. I mean, I could go on. I will carry on a bit longer, because I think one of the things about living here that's been different to being a visitor here is the sense of a nation becoming itself. And I really, really think that's the most significant thing in Wales at the moment. So the Senedd being here in Cardiff, a nation that's not had a capital, well, until 1956 or whenever it was that Cardiff was declared the capital. And I think that sense of, how do we become ourselves, and how do we become an absorbent culture? There was a wonderful YouTube clip recently from I can't remember the actress's name, who was in the It's a Sin series, saying, and she's a black woman, and I'm Welsh too, and in the Welsh class that I go to, there is Muhammad, who is Muslim but was born here and lives here, and he's Welsh too. So an absorbent culture, an absorbent nationhood, a kind of nationalism that is not exclusive, I think is something that Wales is tentatively moving towards. And I think that's a beautiful and wonderful place to be.
The capital of Wales is obviously Machynlleth. And if not Machynlleth, then Aberfraw, but it's definitely in the dirt. It's a bang.
And of course, I inherited the title of this being the National Cathedral of Wales, which you would also disagree with me on.
I might have mentioned this in correspondence. To those who haven't been to the Llandaf Cathedral, I'm not going to make any jokes about its location vis-a-vis any capital. To those who haven't been to Llandaf Cathedral, tell us what it's like. Tell us about its location, the wonderful, interesting building, and the spirituality of the place.
I mean, I absolutely adore it and love it, and I've loved it for a very long time. So the dog who may make an appearance is called Tylo, although I know it's really pronounced Taylo, but nobody in Cardiff pronounces it that way. And he is now 4 years old, so that was well before I became dean. It's an extraordinary building, because it's a building that kind of reflects the Christian story of death and resurrection. So the foundation is 540. So I'm in Canterbury as a newcomer. We vie with St. David's on the earliness of the date, but 540 is probably the date.
It's 15 years after Bangor.
we look for evidence of all of these things. I'm digging every day. It's a, you know, there is an enormous sense for me, but for other people as well, of this place of prayer. It's tucked into a kind of valley, a kind of, you know, a kind of, you know, so it's downwards, which I think is really interesting on the River Taff. Really interesting. It's the original city here. Cardiff is the post-industrial revolution city. So it's the ancient place in this place, which is wonderful. And I liked that tucked awayness. I'm quite interested in the Cistercian links in Wales, which are much later, of course, 12th century. But the Cistercians often built their churches in these tucked away places. So you go to Fountains Abbey and it's tucked down in a valley. So I think there's something interesting about that. Many of the tombs in the cathedral have rosary beads on their side. So there's a devotion to Our Lady. We have the Assumption image on the Martial panel. We have an Assumption carving. So there's for me, a real Cistercian element of devotion to Our Lady. And the Cistercians always call their churches after the place. And I think that's really important. So Our Lady of the Valley, Our Lady of wherever it is, Our Lady of the Taff here, probably. I think that sense of place is really important. So that tucked awayness, which is a bit of a disadvantage in terms of attracting visitor numbers and things like that, I think is really rather lovely. The building itself mainly is 12th century, 1120. The Lady Chapel is 1270 onwards. And then there was war damage. So that building got very destroyed. In the 18th century, they built an Italianate temple in the middle of it, which must have looked ridiculous. And it was demolished by the Victorians, who did a lot of hideous Victorian work. And then one of the best things that ever happened to Llandaf Cathedral was the bomb in August 1941 that fell on the corner of the cathedral and destroyed most of the Victorian woodwork and gave an excuse to get rid of most of that Victorian woodwork and stuff. And George Pace, the architect in the 1950s and early 60s, had this vision of light from the West End to the East End. And he did a fantastic job. I mean, not every detail I would love, but he did a fantastic job of opening up this space so that if you stand at the steps at the West End with the doors open, which I do every morning as long as it's warm enough, you can see right through to the Lady Chapel at the end, and you get light through, which is just fantastic. And he put this amazing concrete arch in the middle, Majestas, with a Jacob Epstein sculpture of Christ, which is actually it's the transfiguration, because there's no marks of the cross. So it's the transfiguration, it's the pre-cross moment there. And I love that. I mean, I love the fact that there are layers of art and beauty. So, I mean, it's a bit of a Marmite image and some people don't like it and all of that kind of thing. But for me, every age should make its mark on this place, as it has. And we have the most amazing Norman arch with lovely roundels and things like that. We also, of course, have the tombs of Dyfrig and Taylor, and the skull of Taylor, which has an amazing history. So we can't absolutely determine where the skull went and when, but it went to the Matthews family, who were the big local landowners. In the 1920s, one of the Matthews family moved to Australia and took the skull with him. And the skull was mounted in a beautiful Art Deco stand. And when he died, his sons said, "We actually don't want this anymore. Would you like it back?" So in the Taylor Chapel, we have the skull of Taylor. And every day, at the beginning of the day, I open the doors and light a candle in front of it and celebrate Mass there next to it. And I have a very strong sense of his presence. And he's a very powerful person. And he, for me, is, people don't like the words leadership and management in the church, but he was a great leader and he was a great manager, because all of the great bishops of the church were those things. And I think the fact that we have his skull, I mean, also his body is in the other bit, but the fact that we have his skull there to reverence is, for me, a sign of his intellect and his power. And he's a very powerful person. So that's very important for me. And one of the most wonderful things is, it's an incredibly busy site. So as I open the doors in the morning, so I get there about 6 o'clock every morning, and hundreds of people pass by, walking their dogs, jogging, on their way to the Metropolitan University. And they are so diverse, these people. And it's fantastic. And when I say the 7 o'clock mass at the Taylor altar, I have no idea who's coming. So it could be 6 nurses from the hospital on their way home. It could be 2 students walking back to their accommodation. The other day, it was 4 young men who had been clubbing all night in Cardiff. And I said to them, has been a good night? And they said, oh, not great. We didn't meet any girls. So they came to mass instead. Isn't that amazing to have this place that draws them in? And, they sense the holiness of the place. Sorry, I've gone on too long. I love it, as you can tell.
When you were at ChristChurch Cathedral in Oxford, you prayed next to the shrine of St. Rhydwaid, the patron saint of Oxford. Her shrine destroyed largely at the Reformation, but still some of it's left. You're praying now by the shrine of Taylor in Llandaf, and you talk about the sense of the presence of Taylor as a person. Does it feel different praying next to 2 saints and inviting them almost to become part of your life and part of your relationship with God? That sense of their presence.
Oh, yes, completely. So I had a bit of grief about leaving Rhydwaid behind. I mean, she, for me, was very much, I always had a sense of her moving around, which was interesting. And there is some historical evidence of the numbers of pilgrims that slept in the shrine in Oxford. So a completely different presence. And I was slightly discombobulated when I moved here. I didn't quite know where to pray. So there's Tylo's tomb, and then there's also the skull. And actually, I started off at the tomb and ended up at the skull. So that was discombobulating. And also, I think I had to work out there's more, strangely enough. I mean, although she's only a century later, when I left Oxford, I told them that I was going to somewhere much older. So it took me a while to work out who Taylor was for me, and what our relationship was going to be like. I love the image of him. One of the stories, 2 images of him. There is a lovely little set of Spicer sculptures under his tomb. So 2 things stand out for me. One is him planting an orchard. And gardens are very important to me. Not that I'm a gardener, but my partner is. And I think that rootedness and that being related to somebody who's rooted in the ground, literally in the ground. I mean, I always, for much of the year, wear sandals, and I always take my shoes off when I can, my sandals off when I can. And, being barefoot behind the altar of the Taylor shrine, I think is really important. So that rootedness. And then there's also an image of him riding a stag. He rode around the bounds, and there's this story of him riding the stag. And I think that sense of how we use power and what power means is really important. I could talk a lot more about that, but people, when you're a dean, people think you're a powerful person, whatever it is. And I think being very aware of where power is in relationships is really important. And I would say those 2 things, that rootedness and that sense of where power is really important for me in my relationship with Taylor. And I think talking to the saints and engaging with them and working out what your relationship is with them is really important. And that kind of goes back to my brother who died and all the dead who were buried around him. You know, these are real people. They're not just the abstract dead. They're not just souls floating around in heaven. These are real, actual people, and how we relate to them is really important. And I think the more we try and relate to them, the more we can find a relationship with them.
I bang on a bit here about Deiniol raising his original Bangor as a shelter and a sanctuary when he got here in 525, 15 years before Llandaf Cathedral was founded. And I'm very encouraged to hear one of our choral scholars telling the story of Deiniol to somebody else the other day. So there is that sense of who was here and that connection to that 6th century time, which was such a significant moment for Christianity in these islands, and the contribution of holy people in this part of the world to the sustaining of Christian faith, hope, and love as a religion in difficult times. Such an interesting period. What does the development of Llandaf Cathedral over the next few years mean for you? What does greater spiritual vibrancy and more hope and grace look like there during the period while you're dean? What are your hopes?
So my hopes are to go deeper, you know, to really enter into the Christian life, and you know, the celebration of the Eucharist regularly, and by that I mean daily, more than once daily. So we have a 7 o'clock Eucharist, an 8 o'clock Eucharist, 9:30 Eucharist twice a week. You know, and deepening it for, I mean, one of the big worries for me about the church is that we act as if the only people who will come to church are retired people, which is why we have 9:30 Eucharists and 10 o'clock Eucharists. And actually, you know, the car park outside my house here is beginning to fill up at 6 o'clock in the morning. You know, I don't think as a church we realize how early people start work. You know, when I was a head teacher, most of my staff would be in the building by 7:30 in the morning. So if you're going to have a mass that they can come to, you've got to have a mass before 7:30. And I think that's a really serious issue, you know, that we don't address or talk about very much. And that's why we have a 7 o'clock mass. I open the building at 6 o'clock. I am rarely alone after 6 o'clock, you know, and it's a weird and wonderful and, you know, amazing group of people that come in, and I sit at the west door so that they come and talk to me if they want to. I heard 2 confessions this morning before 7 o'clock. You know, we need to be available to people, and I think that's really important. So deepening this, and the deepening is also about evangelization. I don't think our 9 o'clock congregation are sufficiently evangelized. They come because they want to get their children into the 3 schools. We've got to evangelize them. We've got to teach them about Jesus. And we are a content-free preaching world. And we have got to teach the basics of the Christian faith. And then I think the 11 o'clock congregation are insufficiently discipled. So once we've evangelized people, we need to disciple them, to take them on a journey. I'm on a journey, we're all on a journey of our Christian lives, of our relationship with Jesus and God. And it shouldn't feel like you've just got there and it just carries on. It's like a really exciting journey, you know, of prayer, and my prayer changes in the decades of my life, and I hope it will continue to change. So that evangelization and discipling are really important. And of course, I hope that will draw more people in so that there will be growth in the congregations. I'd love to do new congregations. We don't get the teenagers, and we don't get the people in their 20s. So we get young professional parents because they want to get their children into the schools, but we don't get the 20s, and we don't get the teenagers. When I was in Liverpool, we started several new congregations in schools, And I think we don't realize quite how off-putting our buildings are, as much as I love them, how off-putting our buildings are. And I think doing some stuff in other places, in other sites, is really important. And I think for me, Citizen Church in Cardiff, that's one of the things that we need to do. They do something that doesn't look like church. We do something that looks like church. How can we dovetail those things together? How can we invite them into this space? So I'm really thrilled that they're coming to do their carol service here in December, and I hope that we'll do more stuff like that as well. So I think there's a job to be done there. There's an enormous job to be done here on the buildings. This is the least interesting thing for me, but it's probably going to take up most of my time. We need to spend about 10 to 15 million pounds to make the buildings suitable. You've got to have disabled access, disabled toilets, a cafe, a shop, all of those things, and we have none of those things here. In a city which attracts 2.4 million visitors a year prior to COVID, we get about, wait for this shocking figure, 15,000. So we've got to do a lot of work on the site, and that's a 10-year project, which I won't probably see to the end of. But the deepening is the key thing that really excites me.
Let me just step back a bit as we come to near the end of this conversation. I think I want to ask you a question about the pain and the difficulty that can be a part of cathedral life occasionally. I know that it will have been the experience of life in Llandaf at some periods in Oxford, and I think it's been the case here. And I think that some of that is about how as clergy we relate and work together. But I wonder what your reflections are on how cathedrals can be more dependably and functionally the healthy lungs, so to speak, that they need to be for the church, for their diocese, and not sometimes gets clogged up with some of the tar that can bring with it suffering and pain.
Yes, big questions, and of course, as you know, that's been a big part of my life over the last 3-4 years. Yes, I mean, I think there is something about all places which are intense communities, that the intensity works in both directions. You get the positive intensity and you get the negative intensity. So it seems to me that cathedrals are always going to be places where negativity becomes more magnified, and places of pilgrimage, Walsingham, Glastonbury, are going to be those places as well. So I don't think we should expect ever a world in which cathedrals and places of pilgrimage will not be places which magnify negativity as well as positivity. I think, history after, 2,000 years shows that that's not the case. So I think we just have to accept that the intensity that is the positive also has this shadow side. I think that's the reality, and I think we have to accept that reality. I think cathedrals, particularly, one of the things about the breaking down of the church in our own time is the breaking down of the pomposity and entitlement. And I think people come to cathedrals for all sorts of reasons, but one of the reasons is they think it's grand and wonderful and it makes them feel important. It's really, being servant ministers is really, really, really important. People constantly say to me, as I take the rubbish out, as I move the chairs around, as I light the candles, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. But it's really important that I do that. I refuse to be called Mr. Dean. I just think we need to prick that bubble quite severely, I love serving the mass, the daily mass at 8 o'clock, and that's really important as well. I mean, we don't live in Trollops, Barchester, and we've just got to give that up. We've just got to throw it away because it completely damages the gospel and doesn't enable us to preach the gospel. And quite a lot of what we need to do in cathedrals is about just get real. We're very small fry people, really, aren't we, cathedrals in this world? And we can put on a big show when we need to, but that's not about entitlement. That's about service. And so one of the big things I think in Wales the cathedrals have not got is understanding their vocation to the wider church and world. And you and I have been at meetings where we've begun to wonder what that might look like and to think about what that might look like. But it's service, it's providing a service to people, and not about being grand and I don't know, whatever, and I think there's probably quite a lot of breaking down to be done, as well as building up around that service, and recognizing our smallness, but also recognizing the opportunity that we have. In Wales, one of the interesting things is that as the nonconformist churches have fallen off the precipice, it leaves the church in Wales in a very privileged position. And so it's a wonderful moment, but we must use the moment well. And that must be about service.
I think my deal here is that anybody's allowed to call me Sean, but I'm still going to be allowed to wear my purple socks. No, more realistically, I think we're doing a bit of work which I think is consonant with some of what you've been talking about in Ddeon Llandaf, in terms of making sure that we're grounded, we're rooted in Welsh soil here and in service of community, in so many different ways, be that through the food bank or through the developing of a more intensive Welsh language ministry.
Yeah, the justice stuff is so important.
Yeah, and it's exciting to see that happening elsewhere in cathedrals too. Penultimate question: you've mentioned Jim, your partner, the carer of the deanery garden in Llandaf, as he will do the wonderful things with his gardening gift that I've seen him do elsewhere. I've actually taken some inspiration from your and Jim's openness and unassumingness about your relationship within a church that is not always kind to gay people, to LGBTQ people in open relationships. Reflect with us a bit on how that's changed over recent years, perhaps, and on what your hopes might be for us in Wales as we continue to live with being a more inclusive church.
I think clergy partners are the true saints of relationships, and Jim is the true saint of this relationship. I have no doubt at all. And we've been together for 38 years now, and the extraordinary journey that society has made in that time. When he and I first had sex, he was committing a criminal offence because he's 12 months older than me and I was 20 at the time. To get from there to civil marriage in one lifetime is the work of the kingdom of God. Sarah Coakley, in her New Asceticism, is best on this, and an absolutely brilliant book, which I would recommend to any. First book that I've said and mentioned in this in this conversation. But yes, so it's an extraordinary journey. But the lovely thing, we've had terrible times. We weren't allowed to live together when I was first ordained, so we have to had two homes, and all of that. And partly why I spent much of my ministry in schools was that I just said, actually, I'm not going to do this. This is not how I want to live my life. I want to live with my partner, so it has been an extraordinary journey. And an extraordinarily painful journey. But journeys are good, I had an extraordinary journey. We had an extraordinary journey with both my parents and his parents over our relationship, from you know, from, you know, having the door shut on me on Christmas Eve and saying I'm not welcome, to my parents absolutely loving him and welcoming him a few years later. And, you know, and I have huge respect for my parents for making that journey, you know, and so we should allow other people to make that journey. But we've always tried to do it by just living our lives, you know, and just, yeah, just being us. You know, we don't need to campaign about this. We just need to live our lives. And I think that's really important. I'm absolutely clear that the ministers of a marriage are the couple. And so Jim and I have been married for 38 years. You know, I would welcome and adore the day when the Church in Wales can solemnize same-sex weddings. But all that we would be doing then is recognizing what already exists. And I think that's really important. The gift of marriage is a gift of God in creation, not the gift of the church. And it has always been the case. So, you know, I mean, it's quite funny for us because in Oxford and here, people constantly say, how's your husband? And, you know, and we're not actually married because we can't. And I wouldn't want to do anything below the belt, if you see what I mean. And I think that's really important. And I think sometimes the Church in Wales pretends to be more inclusive than it is. And it's moved further than the Church of England, but it's not moved far enough. And until we can solemnize marriages, we will not have arrived. And I think I would be absolutely clear about that. You know, Jim and I probably could turn our civil partnership into a marriage, but that would be, for me, not quite the right thing to do until governing body has agreed to do it. And I would challenge governing body to do it as soon as possible. I know there was a 5-year period. Why wait 5 years? I might be dead by then. You know, but I believe entirely that I am married to Jim and have been for 38 years.
Last question from me. As we pray for you here in Bangor, as we pray for you in Llandaf, what can we be praying for in terms of the life and the mission and ministry of the cathedral?
For deepening the life of faith and love, of community, of diversity, of freeing people up to welcome each other. We've introduced sherry after the 11 o'clock mass here, and I think that's a really important thing. But one of the things that I notice is that people talk to the people they know and like. And so how can we become a community that welcomes the stranger? I think that's really important. I mean, that icon of the Trinity by Rublev that's so important to me is, one of the names for it is philoxenia, the love of the stranger. And that's hard for us to do because we all gravitate to people who are like us, you know, and here we get a lot of strangers, you know, and I'm not sure that we are always as welcoming as we could be to them, you know, because we talk to the people we know. So please pray for the love of the stranger.
Thank you, Father, and we will.